Okay, let's try that again. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Leslie Griffin. I'm with UPS here in Washington, but here today in my capacity as this year's President of Women in International Trade. And we are so thrilled at the response and the level of interest we got to this program and this topic. We know that global value chains raise all sorts of interesting questions about trade policy, about job impacts across countries, about consumer implications. So we're thrilled to bring you today what will no doubt be a lively debate on some of these questions, followed by an interesting panel discussion with some experts across multiple sectors looking at global value chain issues. We are pleased to bring you this program today in partnership with GW-U and its Center for International Business, Education, and Research, or CIBER. WIT has been partnering with CIBER over the last couple of years, thanks to the efforts of our immediate past president, Evelyn Suarez, who's forged some great relationships there. We actually did our Women of the Year dinner at GW last year, and we're grateful for the partnership. My job today is going to be to introduce our GW colleague, Professor Michael Moore of the Economics Department at GW. But first, I'd just like to extend a few thanks. I'd like to thank CompTIA, the Tech Association with about 2,000 members. Many of you know they put on our Tech and Trade program last fall. They are this year WIT's Congressional Trade Education sponsor, so I want to thank them in part for this program. I also want to thank the sponsors of our reception, which will follow the substantive program. They are Toyota, the National Customs Brokers and Forwarders Association of America, and GW. And with that, let me now turn to introducing Professor Moore. He received his MS and PhD in economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has had a joint appointment with the Department of Economics and the Elliott School of International Affairs since receiving his doctorate in 1988. Professor Moore's main area of current research is the economics of anti-dumping policy, but he also works on determinants of foreign direct investment as well as the political economy of trade. He's published in numerous academic journals. His commentary has appeared in many media outlets, and he recently completed a year as senior economist for international trade at the President's Council of Economic Advisors. So please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Moore.
So I can't really say recently at the Council of Economic Advisors since that was 2002. So it's a long time. I need to update that bio. And I've been at GW since 1988, which means 30 years, which means that I'm officially a graybeard at GW. But it's my pleasure to be here today representing the GW side of this and the Center for International Business, Education, and Research at the GW's Business School. It's one of 17 centers in the nation that helps international U.S. businesses prosper in a global economy. Always a challenge, and they reach out to students, businesses, the policy community to help promote those efforts. GW's specific theme in CIBER is institutions, policies, and development in international business. So it's not just about developed countries, but more broadly bringing in business opportunities in developing countries. So I'm the faculty coordinator for the International Trade and Investment and Employment part of that program. I'm also teaching in the master's program in International Trade and Investment Policy at GW. So it's my pleasure to moderate this discussion/debate on trade and jobs with two of Washington's two most outstanding specialists in trade policy. To my left, Terry Stewart, long-standing member of the bar here in Washington, D.C., focusing on various aspects of international trade. I can't think of anybody better from the legal profession to talk about some of the issues involving trade. To my right is Chad Bown, also a Wisconsin PhD, so we both think that's a fine place to get a PhD in international trade, and it really was. Chad, also with the Council of Economic Advisors, more recently than me, and now at the Peterson Institute for International International Economic Policy. I forget. Close enough. Peterson Institute. So we're here to talk about trade and jobs. I want to get the discussion going between these two, and then if we have time to bring in the audience for some questions. So I want to first talk about one of the most important issues facing U.S. trade policy, which is basically dealing with the emergence of China. Now that often is very much about, in the public discussion, about jobs and the relationship of the increased competition from China and how that affects U.S. jobs. Now, one of the difficult aspects of the policy world is how to deal with that. If, for example, you're concerned about trade from China and you specifically target Chinese products to help U.S. jobs, there's the possibility that those jobs those imports will simply go to another source of those imports and undercut any of the benefits to U.S. workers and businesses. If you select China alone, you have the potential of having a more broad restrictive policies. For example, with President Trump's proposed steel tariffs, you have the difficulty that you're potentially wrap up other sources of imports, having us run afoul of WTO rules. So it's very difficult to deal with China in the current multilateral system. So I'm going to turn to my esteemed colleagues and say what to do about China in a way that helps U.S. workers but doesn't create unacceptable problems to the rest of the U.S. economy. So, Chad.
So thanks for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure, and thanks for starting off with a really easy question. I guess the way I think about the concerns facing the United States and more broadly the international trading system with China, I think it's worth separating them out. So there's going to be some adjustment that the U.S. economy, the European economy, that all industrialized economies are going to have to undertake when major emerging markets like China, but India, other developing countries as well, come on the scene in the international trading system. They're moving into industries and products where we have historically been producers, as economists would call it, where we have a comparative advantage. They suddenly come in, and we have to shift out of some of those industries. So there's going to inevitably be some adjustment that takes place with the rise of new big countries that weren't there before. So that's just one fact of international trade, be it China, be it somewhere else. The way to deal with that, in my mind, is not through trade policy or trade agreements, but it's recognition that, like technology shocks or automation or artificial intelligence, there are just these forces in the economy that sometimes force industries to have to make adjustments, that force workers to have to make adjustments, and so we need the right domestic policies to help facilitate that kind of adjustment. That's not really a trade agreement kind of a story. It's we need better, mobility assistance policies. We need better, unemployment insurance, wage adjustment kind of assistance schemes to help deal with that. Not necessarily trade policy. But as a separate matter, there are special concerns dealing with the fact that China isn't just any old country that's come on the scene, and that in many respects China is very, very different even from a lot of the other major emerging economies out there, which is it's not yet or currently on the path toward being a market-oriented economy. So obviously it still has heavy government involvement in a lot of industries, and that poses special challenges of its own, and that I'm not quite sure that we're on the path to deal with. There you probably do need to have trade agreements to address some of those kinds of concerns. The WTO and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade before it really weren't designed entirely in mind of addressing interfaces between market economies and non-market economies. The rules seem to be well tailored to allow for interactions between market economies, but with non-market economies, we're not so sure. And I think that's where some of the conflict now comes in.
I'm going to start off this debate by saying that I agree with most of what Chad had to say. I have, however, a few comments about China. and Professor Moore's introductory comments. First, the vast majority of actions that the United States and others take to deal with problems that they're having with China are in the form of bilateral negotiations, where you try to work with your trading partner to identify problems or things that you think are not working, and to the extent they're willing to adjust their policies or to correct them, you do that without there being formal disputes. So what you see in the press tends to be kind of just the tip of the iceberg of engagement, and that's been true since China kind of reemerged and came into the trading system. Most of the actions that the U.S. or others take against China are also directed only at China. And that's true whether it's the 301 investigation that's ongoing on intellectual property at the moment, whether it's trade remedies that are brought under the anti-dumping or countervailing duty laws, whether it's WTO disputes that the U.S. or other countries bring against policies that China has. The real issue with China is not that they're emerging or that they are large or that they are proving to advance very rapidly. All of those things are actually positives. Nobody is opposed to the fact that hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty in developing world, and particularly in China and in India. The issue is that the basis of the entry into the WTO by China was basically the premise that the rest of the world had, that they would be moving towards a market economy. And they certainly took early steps that were in that direction, and during the time of the negotiations they were doing that, but there has been substantial backsliding. And the difficulty with the WTO is that the rules do not address the myriad forms of distortions that are created that cause loss of exports from the U.S. or other countries to China, or that artificially inflate production and exports from China to the rest of the world. The current 232 issue, which has gotten a lot of attention, basically flows from the fact that over a course of 15 years, China went from having 10% of global capacity in steel and aluminum to having 50 to 55% of global capacity. In steel, that created excess capacity that is greater than the total capacity in the United States, Europe, Japan, and Russia, when you add the excess capacity in some other countries. This is a situation that the world has never confronted, and is a situation that can't be resolved without action on the part of the people who created the problem. And obviously the incentive is not there for them to do it. Whether 232 is the right approach to deal with that issue by creating a crisis that gets countries to focus on it, I guess time will tell. But we are increasingly confronting situations with China where the system does not permit a rational resolution, and where you have an administration that is trying to protect U.S. interests, because there are lots of loss of jobs and industries that, while we need better safety net programs, while we need better perhaps domestic policies, that by itself is not going to rebalance the system. Let me stop there.
Okay, so let me follow up on that. So the steel industry has been the recipient of special trade policies at least since the late 1960s, a whole range of Jimmy Carter had the trigger price mechanism. You had the steel quotas by Reagan in '84, the Bush tariffs in 2002, a whole range of actions that were used to address overcapacity, government intervention. So I think the fear of a lot of people viewing the President Trump's trade action is that if China is the problem in this particular case, why are all these countries potentially targeted? Now, I think as an economist, I would think it's because you can't effectively help the steel industry without preventing imports from all countries. But once again, what do we do about trying to address China in a way that actually effectively increases jobs? Because that's what matters to people out in a steel town. Do I get the job? Not whether or not it keeps China out, but do I get to keep my job? What's an effective policy to deal with that?
Well, I think the 232 is the use of a statute that's been on the books basically since the end of the Korean War. For those of you who weren't around during the Korean War, it's the case that we had to have a czar of manufacturing because of the needs to mobilize basically all of the resources of the country to fight. So the statute is written in very broad terms. It is broader than national defense and goes to the protection of core domestic industries. It's been used maybe 25, or it's been invoked maybe 25, 30 times over the last 55 years. Seldom has it been applied, and in other words, seldom has there been relief, and all of the prior administrations have opted to construe the provision very narrowly. But on its face, 232 is something that looks at what you need to maintain an industry that's viewed by the government as critical to our overall national security. The reports that Commerce put out on both of those industries so characterizes steel and aluminum. And Secretary Ross, having made his career and his money buying up bankrupt assets, certainly understands what you need to make an industry successful that's capital intensive like those two industries are. So if the objective of the 232 is to get the industry back on its feet, then the remedy that's been proposed will help do that. Whether there are consequences of that, of course, is what a lot of the press and other reactions have been. But there's very little doubt that if you accept the premise that these industries are strategic national security type of industries, that the remedy to save them fits the need if you reviewed those reports.
So, Chad, could you comment on the use of national security as a argument for protection, and also the potential consequences for the U.S. economy and potentially for U.S. jobs if there might be retaliation?
Sure. So I think there is a really important and open question about just how necessary an action like this is to protect national security. I think one can read the reports and the definitions of critical industries as being extraordinarily broad. I mean, I remember something like they even said in the steel report that it was something like 49% of U.S. industries are within the buckets of the 16 critical industries that they'd identify. So if everything's critical, sort of nothing's critical in some sense. So I think there's a chance that this is just overly broad in that general sense. But I think more importantly is the collateral implications of going down this path and under this law, and having to think through what some of those are. And I think there's potentially many. One of which is this law hasn't been used, but for good reason, is because once we start to use this law, this opens up the door for lots of countries to use their equivalent law whenever they like, for any products they like that they might say are in their national security. So our largest export to China is or amongst our largest export is soybeans. China might say that being so reliant on American soybeans is a threat to their national security, and they need to just impose import restrictions to stop that. Or we may see trading partners retaliate through other actions that are kind of as equally questionable, which may have implications for innocent bystanders in the United States industries, whether it's agriculture, other manufacturing industries that have nothing to do with steel or aluminum, where their jobs may be negatively impacted by retaliation. And then I think there's kind of the bigger systemic concerns as well. So you think through historically how earlier acts of protection have been dealt with, especially under the WTO system. If we think back to the steel safeguard example under the Bush administration, when trading partners were unhappy with it, what they did is they filed a formal dispute. They challenged it. It went through the process. They won. And after 18 months to 2 years, the threat of retaliation then, kind of forced or cajoled the Bush administration to remove the safeguard. But what happened, I think, that was important in a case like that is the problem was contained. It didn't spill over into some sort of lots of tit-for-tat actions that could quickly spiral out of control. And that's what the benefit of sort of working within established trade remedies, trade policies, and these kind of constructs of dispute settlement allows us to do. Going down this path, where you're using a law that really has never been used before, you don't want really countries to challenge it, because if you challenge it at the WTO and they rule against the Trump administration might say, you're having the WTO tell us what's in our national security or not. They might question the legitimacy of the WTO even more than they have thus far, which we know is not high on their list of useful entities. But on the other hand, if the WTO were to rule that this was a perfectly legitimate avenue and course to take under the Article 21 exception, that again opens the door for lots of other countries to do the same thing. So in my mind, going down this path really puts you in a lose-lose situation with respect to the international architecture.
Terry, would you like to respond to any parts of that?
I would. The reality is that countries take a wide variety of actions all the time that trading partners perceive are not consistent with their obligations under the WTO. This is one of the few instances where you see people running around looking to see if the sky is falling, which is kind of interesting. Argentina, a couple of years ago, was having a foreign currency crisis, and so they imposed a requirement that you could only import if you were a company if you had comparable exports. Clear violation of the WTO. Affected everybody who was exporting to Argentina. As far as I can tell, nobody was looking around saying, my God, the system is going to collapse because Argentina did something that we disagree with. Instead, people brought a dispute, and if the dispute went their way, Argentina would either face withdrawal or would change. So there's a lot of discussion by trading partners who are unhappy with the articulation of a national security remedy. We're saying, we will defend our interest, we will defend our interest. Well, if they're scofflaws and they simply do whatever they want, which obviously is a sovereign state they can do, then you have a problem. If they take a case to the WTO and see where that goes, then they're following the system. So it's not the action of the United States that threatens the international architecture. It would be the reaction of trading partners. And in terms of, does this get to China? The answer is it gets to China in part, and it probably gets our trading partners to put more pressure on China. And we have been trying for multiple years to get China to address the problem they have created with this massive excess capacity. And China itself, for the last dozen years, has recognized that it has created, through its policy and subsidy programs, massive excess capacity in dozens of industries. Not just steel, not just aluminum. You could go down a long laundry list. And they have had internal policies that say we are going to correct this. The problem is that in important sectors like steel and aluminum, they make minor adjustments only to be offset by massive additional capacity expansions. For example, in aluminum, in our heyday, the most capacity we had to produce on wrought aluminum was 4 million tons. Which at that time I think was 10 or 15% of world capacity. China took out 4 million tons of capacity between I think 2010 and 2014. And they published that on their website, and you can see it, and it's undoubtedly true that they closed mills that accounted for that. At the same time, between the central, provincial, and local governments, they added 17 million tons of capacity of unwrought aluminum. So what they published was we addressed our excess capacity by reducing it by 4 million tons, when in fact they had basically tripled or more than tripled the excess capacity by adding 17.
So the public clearly is concerned about the relationship between trade and jobs, and I think that's usually in the context of worry about imports destroying jobs. start with you, Terry. When we talk to the public, as you know, people from Washington, D.C., going out into the to our friends and families around the country, how should we discuss that the relationship between jobs and trade? How would you describe that relationship?
Well, I think it depends who you talk to and who is doing the talking. For lots of people across the country, they understand that trade can be important both on the export side and on the import side. The concern tends to be if they don't believe that the game is fair, if the rules don't permit reasonable reciprocity, if there are a series of barriers to U.S. exports that result in us not being able to shift from areas where perhaps we no longer have comparative advantage to areas where we ought to or should have comparative advantage. And China is a classic example of that. If you look at the current trade policy report from USTR, they probably in 10 different places talk about the fact that China has a wide variety of practices which prevent exports from other countries, steal their intellectual property, create non-tariff barriers to see that even foreign investment can't succeed in the country if it's a priority sector for them, and that build up capacity in exports to the U.S. So nobody is opposed to China having successful industries. The question is whether they're having successful industries through a series of practices which are not internationally accepted, agreed upon, and consistent with the trading system. And that is basically the kind of the day in, day out problem that we have with our good friends in China.
Okay, Chet, how would you describe the relationship between trade and jobs to a family in the middle of the country?
That it's complicated. I think, just as Terry put it, it depends on who you talk to. I think, first of all, you need to be willing to have a long conversation with them to explain that, there are costs and shocks associated with trade. So in the economics research world, we have, now seen considerable evidence over the last number of years to show that international trade has led to dislocation and lack of adjustment in certain, targeted communities in the United States that has had bigger anticipated costs than we might have expected. Now, it's not the same thing as saying that the costs were bigger than the gains, but it is to say that there were costs that were perhaps either unanticipated or which weren't addressed well enough through the complementary policies that you need to have to deal with that I talked about before, the kind of labor mobility and sort of adjustment policies. So I think you need to be willing to engage on discussion of what some of the costs of the trade environment are. But then you also need to really have the full discussion and talk about the benefits as well. So the benefits are going to be, yes, the ability to export, and if you're working for companies that export, that's great. Those are typically jobs that pay more, they're higher productivity jobs for companies that typically do a lot of research and development, and the ones that are really, really growing the economy that we want to expand. So that's good. Trade obviously leads to imports that can be positive, that can bring to us both increased varieties of goods. So maybe we're talking about agricultural products that we can't get in the Northeast in the middle of winter, or specialized inputs that we can't produce locally and that are higher quality if we can get them from somewhere else around the world, or that they're just cheaper and they can allow us to have more of our budget left over to be able to spend on non-tradables like leisure or healthcare or whatever. And so there's lots of benefits associated with trade. They kind of go beyond the pure discussion of jobs that I think require you to have a very nuanced and textured conversation that, unfortunately, we don't frequently get to have at the moment anyway in the public debate.
So economists often talk about costs and frictions and adjustment. And out there in the, in someone's hometown, that might mean a plant's shut down. They can't send their kids to school, to college. They lose their pensions. Their house is underwater now. So is there a problem with the way economists talk about the downsides that has been detrimental to the discussion of not really we're being honest, but we aren't necessarily giving it a human face, that that makes people feel like they're not being taken seriously?
Man, I think that's a good question. My sense is the role of economists in the public debate about international trade and trade agreements over the last 30 years or so was to focus on the benefits of them and the expansion of the pie that would happen. But in a lot of times it was seemingly that will happen. We as trade economists, especially those of us that are really focused on this for our profession, we recognize that there will be losers, those that don't benefit, that are going to have to adjust out of these industries. But that's the role of domestic policymakers to have to deal with. We're not going to write rules into trade agreements to deal with that. That's not what trade agreements are for. So basically, I think trade economists have said, well, we'll deal with the trade agreement, and then the dislocation, the adjustment, that will be for the folks that are focusing on domestic policy to deal with. And probably turns out ex post not to have been the right way to think about things. That the trade economists that have been working in this area for a long time probably need to pay a bit more attention to the adjustments that were taking place, making sure that if you were putting all this time and energy explaining the benefits of trade agreements and international trade, that when these trade shocks are happening, you needed to be the ones that were standing up for funding of the social safety net and design of the appropriate adjustment policies. Especially as we've seen that these things, some of the shocks that have happened have been very, very targeted, and entire communities that are tied to an industry, a plant, may have specialized suppliers that are then affected in a second round of layoffs and cuts when the main industry goes under as well. There's just really big. There can be really, really big impacts of this that we hadn't focused enough attention on. So I'm not sure. If we had gone back and 30 years ago, I think, we probably, if we'd seen how this would have played out, maybe we would have done things differently, played a bigger role. I don't think economists were dishonest about the costs and the benefits, but I think we probably could have been a little bit louder in terms of articulating the cost side and to making sure that those complementary policies actually did arrive when they were supposed to.
So Terry, the flip side for the legal profession is that there's sometimes actions that a U.S. firm can request the government to take that are perfectly legal, every right to bring actions for example, the U.S. Trade Commission to restrict imports on some, if a foreign firm is not living up to its WTO obligations, but that the actions can sometimes cause real damage to other U.S. workers, firms, communities that are hurt by the increase in prices associated with those imports. Should we talk about the costs of protection as well as talking about the costs of liberalization?
Well, thank you, Professor. That's an interesting question. I think that it is, like a lot of questions that go to the use of trade remedies, perhaps missing the main point. If you have distortions in trade, it may be that you have a misallocation of resources based on false market signals. What trade remedies are supposed to do is eliminate the false market signals, right? And so if you make it that you have to have gone well down that road, then it may very well be that there are downstream users who should never have established on the basis of very low prices from a foreign country that are going to lose out. So I agree that that can happen. To say that that is the problem of the party who has been promised a remedy if there's an unfair trade practice that's injurious to them seems to me misses the point. I would like to take a minute to go over the issue on the economists, since it's easier for me to talk about them than about my fellow lawyers. And I think that
You can talk about lawyers later. So.
well, I think that there has been, for the last 30, 40 years, a kind of a gross glossing over of what trade liberalization does, whether that be in the models that have been created that the ITC uses, which work off of a basis of assuming 100% employment. something that we have, of course, have all seen repeatedly in our lifetime, and hence reduces the costs that are associated with trade liberalization by a failure of the Congress and administrations to really look at what are causing trade deficits over time if they're perceived to be unsustainable, and that creates huge problems. Let me give you an example out of NAFTA because it's an important issue. This administration has talked, it has two objectives in NAFTA. One is to update the agreement, and the other is to rebalance the agreement. And the area they always talk about is auto and auto parts, right? Where we run a $70 billion trade deficit with Mexico, and we have, I think, a $10 billion deficit with Canada in auto parts. And whether one thinks that's a big deal or important or not, the auto industry and the auto parts industry have basically said, look, this will lead into the next panel because everybody uses global value chains. And there's three primary locations for these, for the centers. You've got Europe, you've got North America, and you've got Asia. Right? That's what they said. It makes perfect sense. And you say, yeah, I understand. It makes sense. Except if you go and you look at the data, and you go back to 1994 when the NAFTA came into effect. And you look at Germany, and you look at Japan, and you look at the United States, and you look at trade in autos and auto parts, what do you find? Japan has amassed an increasingly large trade surplus in those goods, despite having, quote unquote, global value chains to put out the low value parts to other parts of Europe. If you look at Japan, what do you see? Japan has grown its trade surplus in auto and auto parts over that same time period by not exactly the same, but pretty comparable amounts, even though the growth of the Chinese auto industry during the same time. And if you look at the United States, we have been the only one of those three where the invocation of global value chains hides the fact that our deficit has increased by about $100 billion a year. I don't know. Economists would say that's all due to the movement of product out to value chains, and yet it doesn't work in other countries that pay the same wages or higher wages than we pay in the United States. So that can't be the answer. There are policy issues that are there, whether it be the difference in indirect direct taxes. It's been a big issue that the president talks about in terms of the reciprocity tax that's coming down the road, or other things. There are issues that we are not addressing as a nation that are creating an imbalance that doesn't need to be there.
Do you want to address anything that lawyers do, or I'll go on to something else?
I'm married to a lawyer, so I can do that at home, thanks. You can go on to something else.
So the final question is about how one thinks about whether a trade agreement is good or bad for the United States. President Trump seems to focus on bilateral trade deficits. So that's one measure. But there may be others. And I'd like to turn first to Chad about how one thinks about whether or not a trade agreement is good for the U.S. and what trade agreements should be doing. And that's, I'll give you 30 seconds. 15.
Thanks. So that's, I think, the really hard question that I think we've been struggling to articulate an answer to now for a year and a half. We're pretty sure what it's not, how you don't evaluate trade agreements, and that's just by looking at bilateral trade imbalances. Any economist will tell you that it's just an absolutely foolish metric to look at. The country's overall trade deficit or surplus is determined by macroeconomic forces that have nothing to do with trade policy. It's basically, do you consume more than you save? Do you consume and invest more than you save domestically? If so, you have to get it from abroad. And when you borrow from abroad, how do you pay it back? Well, you frequently pay it back by buying more stuff from abroad than you sell to them. And that's just the nature of the bargain. But if that's what determines the overall trade imbalance, then having a particular surplus or deficit with any particular country is then even more at the whim of a lot of things that have just nothing to do with trade policy. So unfortunately, we know it's not trade balances. That's not the answer to the question. So then what is the answer to the question? And that is harder to really pin down. What economists that study trade agreements would tell you is what we really want to do is to think about what the value of the trade agreement is in the first place. And what a fundamental purpose of it is to try to get especially large countries like the United States, the European Union, China, to not impose policies on each other that shift the costs of things, right? So the classic example is the beggar thy neighbor tariff. The reason why I, as a large importing country, want to impose a tariff on China is because some of the costs of that tariff get imposed on China. It drives down the prices that get received by their exporters for the stuff they sell into my market, and I like that. The problem is they have the same incentive to do that to me, and I have the same incentive to do it to Europe. The Europeans have the same incentive to do it to me. So the purpose of the trade agreement is to get all of us so that we don't do that thing to each other, right? And that's what an economist would argue is kind of the fundamental purpose of any trade agreement, to kind of prevent those international externalities from being shifted onto one another. But then there's, I think, other benefits as well, or other ways to evaluate it. Is it rules-based? Does it lead to more market orientation and less sort of state interjection? And there, I think historically we've done quite well. The concern is today, as I think both Terry and I mentioned, the big concern is with China. And are the current rules designed to bring China to become more market-oriented? But also, are we seeing ourselves becoming less and less market-oriented, right? When I look at the Section 232 reports, the big concern that I have is Secretary Ross has identified that we need to have a steel and aluminum industry that's operating at 80% capacity, and until it's doing so, the U.S. government is going to impose tariffs or quotas, right? That was his recommendation. To me, that sounds very, government planning oriented, right? And us moving away from being market oriented. The United States becoming much more like China in some sense, instead of pushing on China to become much more like us.
When I was a lot younger, economists used to say the reason we ran a trade deficit was because we had a budget deficit. And then when President Clinton had budget surpluses, there was a large silence out of the economic community because our trade deficits kept going up in that time period. So we've had a shifting justification for trade deficits. What is clear is that we have a poor ability to predict what is going to happen. ITC has done a very poor job over time, not that they don't do their best and try, but there's never been a trade agreement that the ITC hasn't projected would result in large increases in trade surpluses for the United States. And that's happened in some of our trade agreements, but obviously hasn't happened in a bunch of others. When you think about, so I disagree that when you have large trade deficits, that there isn't a need for a review of policy, both trade and domestic, to try to figure out what's going on. And when you look at a country like China, it used to be that justification for the U.S. running a trade deficit was that we grew faster than the rest of the world. Now, that obviously hasn't been true in the last 20 years when China has been growing at 2 or 3 times our size. And yet, China has never run a trade deficit, despite outgrowing the world 2 to 3 times. So there appears to be a lot of economic principles which only apply to the West and not to some of our trading partners. And I think that comes from a lack of willingness to face what is really causing the problem and trying to address those.
Okay. Well, I think we have exhausted our time, so I'm glad we have solved all the issues about trade and jobs. That was easy, done, 50 minutes. So thank you very much, Terry and Chad, for getting everything sorted out. So please join me in thanking them.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the terrific discussion of the issues. Before we turn to our next panel discussion on trade and jobs and the impact of trade on supply chains and trade. From an industry perspective, I want to introduce Andrea Durkin, and Andrea is with Trade Vistas, and Trade Vistas does work to explain how trade works.
We're going to show you a little video before I talk. Choose the video. Oh, we go to the about,
Good ideas, packaged up as the things we buy and sell every day, move around the world constantly. We may not always be aware of it, but international trade is part of our daily lives, whether you live in Southeast Asia or Des Moines, Iowa. It's easier than ever to trade with anyone, almost anywhere in the world. But as familiar as trade is, few other topics carry as much heated rhetoric or conflicting claims. That's why we created Trade Vistas. The team at Trade Vistas is dedicated to providing clarity and context for the global conversation about trade. We strive to bring you analysis, insights, and data from the impact of technologies that shape our jobs and our economy to the stories behind the products and services that are part of your life. Join us for this important conversation at Trade Vistas.
so that we don't shift into another, an unsavory YouTube video. I'll let the maybe people turn that off. So, I hate when that happens. You don't know what's going to pop up next. So, thanks to WIT and to GW for letting me do this commercial. As Evelyn said, I'm Andrea Durkin. I'm the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Trade Vistas. We launched a year and a half ago. It's a microsite under the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. And so we're still pretty new, but I'm excited to say that we are being read in 150 countries. We've got a pretty substantial following email subscription, so I'm going to encourage you, I'll give you the website and encourage you to sign up. And it's really not just inside the Beltway readers. We've got over 15,000 Facebook followers, and we just started doing social about a year ago. So I know that's our target is more like 1 million, so 15,000 doesn't sound like a lot, but we're increasing every week. And what that really tells me is that the way that we are writing and talking about trade is resonating with the average person, that they will like it, because it's, I was nervous when we started it. Are people really going to actually give a thumbs up to a trade piece? Are you going to engage with it that way? And I'm convinced over the year that we can talk about trade in a way that engages people. And we do this in a very, even though I'm housed in a think tank, we do it in a very unthink tanky way. We launched before the election, and we were concerned that trade was spoken about in a negative light by all parties, and that's actually quite out of step when you look at all of the polls, Pew Research and others. It's very out of step with what Americans think about trade. They're actually very optimistic. More than, I don't know, somewhere mid-60s% of people will tell you that they think that trade is good for the U.S. economy, and not just good for the economy, but good for their pocketbook and important to their lifestyle choices. And so we try to write Trade Vistas really geared toward the general public. It's expert, but it's written in plain English. It's evergreen content. The idea is that we're creating a library of information on trade policies that you can pull off the shelf when you need to. So we write this in a way to be evergreen, but to be relevant to the policy discussion so that people have factual information. We're not advocating anything. We're nonpartisan. But we want people to have accessible information to understand the debates that we're having, like the one we had just now, and the one we're going to have in a minute. And it's never going to replace, I'm standing here on the Hill, I know it's never going to replace, and we don't want it to replace, Congressional Research Service reports or the kind of things that Peterson will put out. But that's really inside ball for policymakers and people like yourselves, staffing. And what we really want to do is be kind of the Reader's Digest you're okay. And a curator of user-friendly trade resources, and as a conduit for grassroots engagement with your constituents. So I hope that you will also see Trade Vistas as a resource for you in your jobs, but that you'll also share it with your constituents so that you're giving them a tool that they can access whenever they want to. We try to make it very personal. We try to engage readers in a way that speaks to their personal lives and the role of trade in their communities. And we have a board of advisors who are all millennials. So we've kind of eschewed the graybeard approach, and the millennials will tell us whether the topics we're hitting on are interesting to them, relevant to them, whether we're on the right platforms. We're not. We need to be on Instagram and be doing other things, and we're going to get there. So they're helping to steer us and steer the way that we talk about trade, and I'm getting many more of them to be writing for us because they really talk about trade using different terminology. And I think it's important for us to listen to that. And given the demographic, this is the future of trade policy is the millennials and the way they think and talk about trade. So again, I wanted to introduce it to you as a resource for you and your jobs. I hear from people happily that they will take some of our pieces and give it to the boss to explain things. That's perfectly okay. That's what we want you to do. It's all in the Creative Commons. So use it, share it. And hopefully you'll sign up. So it's tradevistas.csis.org. Yes. I don't know. I had a spacing moment where it's .com. No, I think it's .org. And let us know what you think. If there are topics we haven't covered, and there's many of them because we just started a year and a half ago, write to me and we'll endeavor to tackle it. So thank you for that, and good luck with the next panel.
Hello, everybody. Let's see. We have. We are. Can you all hear me? I think you can all hear me without the mic, anyhow. I'm delighted to have 4 individuals, and we will have 4 individuals in a few minutes. One of our speakers, Christine Bliss, is testifying at the U.S. International Trade Commission, the ITC, on digital at a hearing on digital trade, and she will be joining us shortly. But I have a great panel in different industries, and they're in industries that are all involved in the global value chain. My name is Evelyn Suarez. I have to make a confession. I'm a lawyer, and I have my own firm. I am the immediate past president of WIT, and you've heard about that great organization. And I'm also associated with GW-CIBER, being on their advisory council. And it's a very good, it's a pleasure and an honor to be on their advisory council. So I'm going to first introduce our speakers. Next to me is Angela Marshall Hoffman, who I know very well through WIT. She is also a past president of WIT and also a past president of OWIT, the Organization of Women in International Trade. And that's sort of the mothership for all the chapters of organizations like WIT across the country and across the world. Angela has many, many years of experience. We won't say how many, right, Angela? I'm not gonna, at working on the Hill here and in the executive branch. When we got to know each other, well, I got to know you when you were working at Walmart as a VP on trade issues. She is now a co-founder of a new organization called Farmers for Free Trade, and you'll hear much more about that from her. Next to Angela is Julie Hughes, also a very good old friend, and also associated with WIT and OWIT. And in fact, Julie was the first president of WIT and OWIT. Okay, so we're heavily promoting WIT and OWIT, right? And women. Okay. Yeah, right. Okay, we're allowed to do that, right. So Julie is president of the U.S. Fashion Industry Association, and USFIA represents brands, retailers, importers, and wholesalers based in the United States and doing business globally. So that's Julie's stuff. Leila Afas is with Toyota, and she's going to tell us about the automotive coalition called Driving America. Leila is Director of International Public Policy for Toyota Motor North America. And in her job, Leila works with Toyota's external affairs and corporate strategy teams to develop and advocate positions on global issues. And finally, we do have Christine here, which is great, and it's great that you were able to join us so quickly. Christine is the president of the Coalition for Services Industries. Before becoming president of CSI in 2016, Christine was Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Services, Investment, Telecommunications, and E-commerce, all very timely and issues today. So I think we're turning to a different perspective. Before we were talked about more of a debate or hypothetically or academically, but each of these groups represents an organization that represents an industry that is deeply involved in the global value chain. So what I'm going to do is let each of them tell you about their coalition. Do you want to start with, you can, Angela, we can just go down the line.
All right, I may be sitting on my microphone here.
I think you are sitting on your, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so not to fall off that chair.
I know.
Not too bad.
Challenging.
They are.
They're a little,
Yes. All right, well, thank you this afternoon. So I'm Angela Hoffman and have known many of you in many capacities over the years. And some of you may be thinking, now what is she doing with farmers? But I can prove you one thing. I'm actually a rancher. I have my own brand from Wyoming. And a big part of why Farmers for Free Trade was formed this last year, and I live in Arkansas, by the way, still, even though I'm here a lot, we really saw that there was an opportunity to reset the narrative in the heartland. And certainly a group that had always been pro-trade certainly found themselves on the other side of the trade political spectrum. So Farmers for Free Trade is a nonprofit. It's a 501c4. It's based in Montana. It's co-chaired in a bipartisan basis by former Senator Max Baucus and former Senator Dick Kluger. And they saw a common nexus, which was how do we have a conversation in a way that explains trade that matters to farmers and ranchers. It takes away the trade gobbledygook, and I love the alphabet soup. I've been there for many, many years. But in agriculture country, it's really about how do you sell more, how do you cut your costs, how do you simplify the system, and how do you resolve disputes when you have them. It's just that simple. Andrea, I love your work, by the way, so that's something we want to use. The other thing we realized as we talk about this is that there's a nexus. There's a nexus from ag to manufacturing, ag to services, and throughout the global value chain, because that's how it starts. It goes from the seed to the field to the manufacturing equipment, up the chain. It eventually becomes a product that's sold in stores throughout the world. So we're excited to be here. We're working really hard. I'll tell you, this is the first time I've had a suit on in many months. I've been in cowboy boots at so many conferences across this country. It's nice to have a little bit of a change. So thanks for being here today, and we look forward to the conversation.
Thanks. So I'm Julie Hughes, and I'm really here on behalf of a coalition, the U.S. Global Value Chain Coalition. So why did we think that we need such a coalition? Those of us in consumer products, so apparel, footwear, home products, we've been talking for a while about the fact that when you talk about trade in Washington, everybody loves exports, and not everybody loves imports. But the fact is that imports are a lot of what we wear every day, a lot of products that we use as inputs, but it's finished goods as well, and the imports are not bad. Imports support jobs here too. So a group of us have been having this conversation for a while, and then there was the election. And so kind of after the election, we met and we looked at each other and we said, all right, it's time now. We really need to let's put together a strategy and a plan for how can we start talking to policymakers about these issues and explain, right, we're talking about trade and jobs today, about the jobs that are brought to us because of imports. And so that's really our goal and that's our mission. So we started talking about consumer products like what I would normally be talking about, clothing or footwear or home textiles. But our goal is to expand this coalition to basically everybody, because we all have a story to tell about global value chains and the jobs that are here in the U.S. And I know later we're going to have questions where I can talk some more about some of the work that the coalition has already done and the fact that if you're wearing a T-shirt from Mexico, I won't use China today for my example, but if you're wearing a T-shirt from somewhere else, that actually in our analysis and studies that we've done, more than 70% of the value actually is right here in the United States. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about where that value comes from and why. But we're excited about the coalition. Some of you here are members of our coalition, and I hope others will join as well, so that we expand the narrative to the jobs, not just manufacturing jobs. And when we've been to the White House, that's all that people want to talk about. But there are a lot of jobs that are high-paying jobs that aren't just in manufacturing. I'll stop there.
Hello, everyone. There we go. Nice segue. I'm Leila Afas. I'm here representing the Driving American Jobs Coalition, which was formed also rather recently. And when we thought that there was a threat of NAFTA going away. And it really is a coalition that does not just represent automakers such as Toyota or Ford or GM or Honda, but also the suppliers, the trade associations, the small companies that feed up into our the vehicles that you actually see on the roads. And when I joined Toyota, which was rather recently, I was really fascinated to learn that 70% of what's in our vehicles actually comes from these small suppliers, and many of them are very, very small. And you're such a highly integrated supply chain. And since NAFTA became law in 1994, our industry in particular, but I think many manufacturing industries, started to view all of North America as a common manufacturing base, but also a common market. And that ability to sort of be able to leverage the skills and abilities across all three countries has enabled us to be incredibly competitive on the global market. And from Toyota's perspective, we really grew up under NAFTA. The year before NAFTA came into effect, we only had 2 plants in the United States. And since then, we've built 8 more plants here in America, and we just announced another plant through a joint venture with Mazda, and that will be built in Alabama, so that'll make it our 11th plant in the United States over the past 24 years. We're very proud of that fact. We're also proud of, 70% of what we sell here is made here. And so there's a lot of myths. I was on the soccer field. I am a soccer mom. Should have added that to my title, Evelyn. I was on the soccer field with my kids and talking to some of the parents on the sidelines, and they're like, oh, you work for Toyota? Yeah, so do you make anything here in America? And I'm like, oh my God, yes. Most of it, our largest plant in the entire world is in Georgetown, Kentucky. You know what I mean? We employ like over 136,000 Americans across the country. Yes. So I had a great opportunity to practice for today by talking to the poor guy on the soccer field. But I think that's what we want, the message we want to get out. Because as Chad and they mentioned earlier today in the debate, the fact that we've kind of ignored these stories. We kind of ignored sharing. We took it for granted that you understand that your clothes, your shirt made in Indonesia, we'll use another country, and shoes made in Italy, or your food coming from all over the world. You take for granted that that's available, or the services that you rely upon can come from anywhere in the world. And we need to not take that for granted. We need to take the time to share those stories, to explain that. And for the auto industry, we've had a tremendous comeback over the past few years. I mean, you saw the decimation of many economies, but ours, unfortunately, with the financial crisis. But since then, the trajectory has been tremendous. And a lot of that's thanks to the incredibly skilled workers that we have right here. And so we don't want to sort of change the rules of the game in the middle of a comeback. And so that's why we formed this coalition to really fight for NAFTA. But larger than that, really explain the benefits and how it works together. And despite sort of the perception, how much sort of the ability to trade, especially across the borders, and NAFTA keeps manufacturing here in America.
Well, great, and it's fun to be at the end of the line here, because actually one of the great things that I've really enjoyed, I've been at the Coalition of Services Industries for just about 2.5 years now, and as Evelyn mentioned, I was at USTR as a trade negotiator, and what has been so gratifying and really interesting is the degree to which CSI, especially over the last, I would say, 2 years in particular, has been able to work even more closely with other associations and companies in town, not just in the services sector, but in the manufacturing sector, and thanks to Angela and others, we hope even more in the ag sector. Because I think one of our challenges, CSI has been around since 1982, and the organization has been involved in every major trade debate on trade agreement negotiation or investment negotiation since then, focused on services issues. And we represent really the broad spectrum of the services community, everything from financial services to information communication technology services, professional services, distribution, and logistics, very importantly, professional services, media, and entertainment. And what has happened, I would say two things in particular, is one is that the digital revolution has very, very much transformed services and is transforming services. So that it won't surprise you to know that one of our foremost issues that we focus on is digital trade and trying to fight for really strong rules in our trade agreements on digital trade to make sure data flows are free and there are no data localization requirements. And then there are a whole host of other activities that build on that, whether it's in the logistics or other areas, retail areas where things like customs and raising the de minimis level are so important to us. But what I was going to emphasize is because every service sector literally now is becoming digital in one way or another, that has become a really preeminent issue. But the other thing I would say, the other major and important development is that services for the longest time was really thought sort of in its own shell, in its own silo, and somehow not really related, not really related to other sectors in the economy, which couldn't be farther than the truth. Now, yes, it is true that 8 out of 10 of us work in some kind of services job, and it's 80% of our GDP. But what's more important is that if you literally go down the row here, whether it's manufacturing, specifically auto manufacturing, and you can correct my numbers if you think they're wrong, but the example we like to use is that upwards of 50% of the value input into auto manufacturing is services of one sort or another. So beginning from the beginning on the factory floor to the end stage when the car is rolled out and sold and distributed, there are service suppliers working alongside what would be considered traditional manufacturing jobs. So manufacturing, there's a huge element of services. In the retail industry and apparel and retailing services, retailing is service in and of itself, but the distribution, the financing, everything from beginning to end, again, is supported by services. And in agriculture, similarly, getting the product planted from the farmer on his tractor in the field to literally harvesting, getting the products to market, insuring them, financing them, services is supporting every step along the way. So one of the things that we have been trying to do in every trade and negotiation, and particularly NAFTA now, and TPP before, we make the case and are trying to make the case of how services isn't just a function in and of itself, but it's also supporting other sectors in the economy. So when you're making liberalization commitments for the benefit of services, oftentimes you are also doing it for those other sectors of the economy. So it's not just a zero-sum game. We're very integrated into the rest of what's going on. And so my last point is that ties very much, I think, into the topic we're going to talk about today, which is global value chains. And from our perspective, we're looking at it both ways, both what comes into the United States, but also what goes out. But thank you.
Well, Leila, you reminded me all the things that I used to learn on the soccer field, and I don't learn anymore, and all the people I met. You know, it's very, especially in this town. So let's, I'm going to address this question to Julie, because Julie alluded to a study that the Global Value Chain Coalition did and rolled out. And she's going to tell us, first of all, I think we talk about global value chains, and I think people understand it, but maybe they don't understand it all that well. So I thought that Julie could explain a typical global value chain and tell us about their study.
Sure. Thanks, Evelyn. Well, and of course, it's easy to talk about clothes because everybody wears clothes. So the study that we did, Christy mentioned TPP. So initially talking about TPP, we did a study looking at the job creation and the value here in the US. And then last year, we updated that study again. And we did an analysis of 5 apparel products, men's and women's knit cotton knit tops, men's and women's woven cotton bottoms, denim and not denim, and then also some outerwear for women, water resistant and non-water resistant. So we looked at that, and what was different about our study than, say, the iPod study or some similar ones is that some of our companies, brands, and retailers allowed the researcher who did the work to come in and look at the real numbers. So we weren't looking at, what might be the data that is the public data and try to extrapolate percentages. This was real numbers at real companies from the beginning of the process to the end of the process. And that's where we found that it was more than 70% for some products, hit 80% value in the US, even though our criteria was 100% manufactured outside the US. So basically, we pulled out the manufacturing piece and said, we're not counting any of that as US content. We want to look at what happens before manufacturing and what happens after manufacturing. So what we found, I'm not going to go on forever on this, although we could talk more about it later, is, we looked at, so what happens when your clothes are made? I mean, there's a design component, right? And there are a lot of people who are engaged in product development and design and picking the fabrics. And for most of our brands, almost all of that actually happens here in the US at the headquarters for companies. It doesn't happen overseas, even with product that's made overseas. And then we have a sourcing component. And for apparel in particular, more than 90% of apparel is imported into the US. More than 90% of footwear is imported into the US. So a lot of it is sourcing. Where are the factories that you go to, and a lot of issues that are part of that decision, not just the quality and can they make the product, can they deliver it on time? Do they have compliance, safety programs, social compliance programs? Can they meet the criteria of your company, which might vary? So all of that happens before manufacturing. You manufacture any place in the world. And then after, what we looked at in the study is what happens then. So there's a distribution component, which happens, you're moving the goods, you're dealing with airlines or ocean carriers, you're dealing with your customs brokers, you're dealing with your freight forwarders to get the product to the warehouse, to the store. And then you have what we call, the customer experience. So what happens at the store? You have people who are in the store, they're stocking the shelves, they're the salespeople, hopefully, that you're talking to, and there's e-commerce. And so what we found was new, different, and where we had even more jobs last year is at the end with e-commerce, where the hottest jobs in our sector is to find good software engineers who can work on your e-commerce site and your website, and they're in huge demand. Like that is an issue for us to find enough software folks. And looking at the beginning of it, where there's more R&D now in your clothing. And so one of the examples from one of our coalition members is from Gap, who has the white jeans now that you can pour red wine on and they won't stain. And that's because they were engineered. And Target, who engineered the knees, for those of you with little kids, they engineered the knees so that the knees last 50 times longer from washes because there is what we call engineered cotton that's used in that. So it kind of reflects, once again, we go to the services side, we go to the ag side, we're working with the cotton folks to how can we improve cotton, that all of those jobs are used to make your apparel.
So maybe a white couch is in the offing.
I might still be scared about that, but it can happen.
Okay, because I tend to avoid white clothes. Kids, pets. They seem to.
We're going to help you out there.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. I think I'd like to turn to Leila because we hear about automotive supply chain, especially in the context of NAFTA. But just tell us about the supply chain and a little bit, if you can.
Sure. Well, the first thing is many people overlook this, but NAFTA is the largest trade agreement in the entire world. I mean, so it's a really incredible piece of an agreement that sort of makes our three countries sort of this one common market and manufacturing base. And our supply chain is so heavily integrated that there was a great Wall Street Journal article that said there's really no such thing as an American car or Mexican car or Canadian car. It's a North American car. I think that's very true. And they said that, you know, just making one vehicle, the parts and components cross the borders of Canada, US, and Mexico up to 7 or 8 times. I think that's a very important visual in terms of how we construct these. We don't look at it as just sort of being made in one place. And when you take into account all the services that go into it, whether it's like the design services, the engineering services, you know, increasingly cars are basically cell phones on wheels. So it's, you know, the IT components that are in it. I mean, and it's just really incredible to see firsthand and how integrated not just the supply chains are, but how the companies are. You know, at Toyota, we have a facility where we have our suppliers for the first time ever working alongside us because we want to make sure that everything's done just in time. We want to make sure that it's highly integrated. We want to look at the parts and components and make sure that there's this, you know, state-of-the-art in terms of technology, but also in terms of safety, of course, the number one priority always. And so it's really fascinating to think about how these work and how just one piece of that supply chain being disrupted can totally impact your production. I mean, case in point, when the 2011 earthquake and tsunami hit Japan, the first plant to close was a General Motors plant here in the United States because they were, you know, you would have thought it would be one of the Japanese automakers or something, but it wasn't because that's how highly integrated our supply chain is. And we're not just facing threats of a possible disruption of NAFTA, but if you look at what's happening on the Korean Peninsula and how many, not just auto companies, but all companies rely upon semiconductors, rely upon things coming, what will that do with trade routes? And I think that it's important to, and I love trade vistas, I'm going to give you another shout out, because you literally see this, it visualizes this, and a lot of people don't necessarily take the time to think about, you know, where all these different parts come from, and it's not just our industry, but all industries, all working together, and I think it's a wonderful thing to see that we can sort of rely upon the best of the best from all over the world, not just in our own market, but for the auto industry in particular. I mean, it really is just fascinating how they've been able to develop these highly complex supply chains that can respond to market demands, consistently innovate, and just offer the products that consumers want, and really at competitive prices, which is also a key part of it.
Angela, do you have anything to add, or would you like to say something?
Valentin? Well, sure. Well, you know, I love it. It's the, you know, a couple degrees of separation here, which is, you know, I love the image of sort of our farmers and ranchers wearing a pair of the Levi's with Texas cotton, sitting on a tractor or their truck that's produced here in the U.S. and using a technology that's either GPS that's helping them have smarter decisions or a drone flying in their fields. And so there really is this level of connectivity. In terms of sort of agriculture and the integrated supply chain, it is very much a North American supply chain, which is also contingent on the fact that most of the ag products were a net exporter here in the U.S. So very much keeping in mind new market access is critical to what they're doing. But a great example, we were just in Mexico City last week, and we brought in a barley producer from Montana. He's just on the High Line. And what I learned about barley is to beer as grapes are to wine. So that means it's a very special variety. And for these producers, they in fact had locked in a 10-year contract with Constellation Brands in Mexico, which then produces the beer, and then it's re-imported back to the U.S. So that whole supply chain of value comes back. But not only is it just the buying contract, but it was the shippers. How do they move the product throughout the supply chain? The marketers, the processors, and more. If anything in that supply chain becomes imbalanced, the entire thing falls apart. And one thing we're hearing right now in terms of producers, they're getting ready to go to the farms and field right now. They are making purchasing decisions. Will they buy that tractor? Will they invest in that new truck? Maybe yes, maybe no. If their guaranteed market goes away, they're not going to make those decisions. And so in our value chain, we see the trickle-on effect to the communities in terms of financial lending and more, where right now they are making those decisions, whether they stay in the commodity line, they may shift, and they really want to be a reliable supplier. That's what their brand is. They're the best products in the world. So we're seeing this connectivity all happening right now, and I think the level of what's happening in trade right now is one of the most, I won't say disconcerting, but it's a very confusing time for those who are trying to make very smart business decisions that, in fact, impact the entire supply chain.
It's quite amazing how efficient value chains and supply chains are, because a disruption really demonstrates that. I mean, going back to 9/11, I guess there was disruptions at the Canadian border with the automotive industry. Right. Since we've talked a little bit about NAFTA already, we touched on NAFTA, and NAFTA is being renegotiated. It's a 24-year-old agreement that could use a little modernization and an update. We didn't have e-commerce then. We didn't have, trade has changed. I mean, it's more than, and most of our trade agreements that we are negotiating today are more than just eliminating tariffs, but also introducing rules. So if you could tell me, please, what you would like to see in, if we could succeed in NAFTA, what would you like to see? What are the things you'd like to see out of NAFTA, and also if you have any concerns in the negotiations?
Mr. Christine. Well, we really do have our oh, sorry, yes. List of priorities, but probably the number one priority for us going forward, and I think you will hear this across the business community, is to preserve the existing NAFTA framework because of the extreme importance it has had as the foundation for building these supply chains and commerce that is going across borders in both directions. So that's our number one priority in services. But as Evelyn said, you're absolutely right. There is room for modernization. So we're staunch supporters of that. And probably the top area is the area of digital trade, where we didn't have the disciplines that were developed in TPP. And we're now in the process of negotiating those, and actually even hopefully higher standard disciplines than were negotiated in TPP. So that's a really important area. And as I say, I think it's a priority really almost across the board for companies and sectors, very important. Financial services is another area where we want to see some real improvements. And there I would say it's both in terms of investment protections, and I will just quickly say that for services, investment protections are extraordinarily important. In terms of relying on the certainty of those investment rules and that they're binding, but also in terms of investor state, which we also think is incredibly important for services and want to see it expanded for financial services as well. Obviously, a very, very difficult issue to deal with. But also cross-border services, where we want to build on the existing chapter and expand it, expand access and commitments for areas like logistics and delivery services. Also, insurance is another area where we're looking for greater commitments. And we're also looking to make sure that countries like Canada and Mexico don't roll back their existing commitments. So for our media and entertainment folks and our ICT folks, trying to make sure that there aren't new exceptions for cultural industries or content. So that's another area. The last area I will mention in particular is procurement, which is another area where you might not associate with services, but actually it's incredibly important, and particularly for financial services, where, believe it or not, a major U.S. insurer provides insurance for 3 out of 4 Mexican government employees. So just another example where NAFTA has provided tremendous benefits to U.S. service suppliers, and we want to certainly see them continue and also be reinforced. So let me stop there, because I know there's a lot that others will want to add as well. But all of those things, I could, and I won't do it now, but I could give you examples of how each of those things is going to also redound to the benefit of the other sectors that we work with.
Okay, any other comments? Anybody want to add? Excuse me?
I mean, I'll definitely add, and then we have to talk about autos too, and ag. But all right, we don't have to, but we probably should. But well, just to say, from an textile apparel perspective, we went into this, and what we said to the administration and to the Canadians and the Mexicans is, do no harm. Do not destroy what is a very successful supply chain and relationship. And for our sector, we actually have a trade surplus, and yet we have been told that some of the benefits that we rely on may go away in an effort to bring more manufacturing back to the US. So kind of our perspective is, wait a minute, in the effort to try to move the needle a little bit for US manufacturing, you could lose the whole thing by making it harder to do business and say to companies, why are you trying to make it work here with Canada and Mexico when you can go to Asia or to some other part of the world and have it be easier? So like, we're really focused right now on a fight, which I hate to be fighting just to keep the status quo, but for the most part, aside from e-commerce and a lot of the improvements that we want in process for distribution, is to hold on to what we have, because so far the administration position had been that they were going to try to take apart some of the benefits for our sector. So we're very concerned about what happens next with NAFTA.
All right, so NAFTA, critically important, and that's, a large reason that Farmers for Free Trade was originally founded. At a time when TPP took a critical market of Japan off the table, that was going to be a tremendous growth market. At a time when now potential tariffs, farmers are going to be the tip of the spear. If anything's going to be on retaliation that's related to steel, we know that. At a time when commodity prices are at an all-time low, this is not the time for disruption. And I think the number one goal, there are issues that need to be fixed and resolved within NAFTA, needs to be modernized, needs to have everything related to services, e-commerce, and more. But for our producers, what they really need is to have the looming specter of withdrawal permanently removed.
No, I agree. And we've already seen some sort of rumblings in the markets when it looks close to that kind of disruption happening, and couldn't agree more. I mean, we keep what works. It works as a trilateral agreement. It works keeping a duty-free access across all three countries. Modernize the things. I mean, the internet was in its infancy in 1994 when NAFTA went into force. So yeah, there are clear things that we can do there. But I think importantly, we need to work together, not just with our partners in Canada and Mexico, but also with our industry and government, working together to find solutions that work and that will last us to truly make NAFTA a 21st century agreement. And just to add to your disruption, I mean, one thing when we were down in Mexico City last year that the Canadian-Mexican negotiators made clear to us is that we're negotiating this NAFTA agreement, and we're, this Thursday, they're signing the new TPP, the CPTPP. And so that's going to open up whole new markets to our northern and southern neighbor that we're not part of anymore. And so, what does that mean for each of our industries in turn? So I think there's, you can't look at things in siloed. They're all integrated like this, including our sectors, including our country. So we have to take that into consideration.
Okay, well, your answers touch on two more questions that I want to ask you. But the first one has to do with these 232 remedies, proposed remedies on steel and aluminum. And I just wanted to ask, how does this affect your sector? The proposed remedies. We can go down the line.
You want to take the first one?
Angela, you touched on it a little bit.
Well, and
You can elaborate a little more.
So I think we've already heard from some of our trading partners that agriculture will be the intended area of retaliation. But we're seeing that in other areas. We're already seeing the possibility even with China and sorghum. It's driving down commodity prices. They are looking for alternative markets. Just this week, in fact, yesterday I was having a long conversation with one of the producers who said, "Is this real?" And I said, "Yeah, it's real. It's a real threat." He said, "It's interesting because I'm trying to invest in my equipment and more, and they're already increasing the prices on my inputs." So whether or not the trigger has been pulled, it's already hitting their bottom line. Again, at a time when disruption and increased cost of production, they just can't take it within the industry. So it's real.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say it broke my heart that the first things that the EU spoke about for retaliation were Levi's blue jeans. Come on. Yes, the Bourbon and the Harley Davidsons, but California, Levi's, why are we picking on them? But I think it reflects kind of what we all recognize is that when it's a quintessential American iconic product, People are going to think about retaliation, and we all sectors have the potential to be hurt as part of that retaliation. So, directly the steel and aluminum may not affect the apparel producers, but actually what happens in global trade affects all of us for all our products.
So they directly impact us. So steel and aluminum are kind of key for a lot of products we produce, and something, of course, affects the entire industry and our suppliers most readily because they are more on the commodity side and they immediately see the jump up in price. And I think we only have to look to history to see what happens when you have tariffs. We don't have to go all the way back to the Smoot-Hawley. I mean, that's like your classic example of what not to do. But we can just go back to 2002 when President George W. Bush put tariffs on steel. It immediately led to a shortage of material, delays in production, increased costs, and unfortunately, and worst of all, the loss of U.S. jobs. One report put that at 200,000 U.S. jobs that were lost, which is why the following year they revoked the tariffs because they realized they did not work. And not only did they not work, but they the harm was so immediate and was so painful, especially to the exact communities they intended to benefit. And so I think I think there's been a cacophony of voices right now sort of against what these would do. Many members of the President's Party and as well as trade associations. I mean, I keep getting my Wall Street Journal and Politico pop-ups for new quotes. So I hope that I understand sort of the motivation behind this. I think it's a worthwhile one and one that we can all work towards solving in terms of helping create those jobs and do that. And we're on our way to doing that. I think we've seen a lot of investment announcements across the United States in recent months. And I think that that's the way to handle it. And especially the fact that even before we had these historic tax cuts that made our tax rate the lowest corporate rate among most OECD countries, even before we had regulatory reform that cut back a lot of these things, a lot of the sort of red tape and hassles of complying with various regulations, the U.S. was the #1 foreign direct investment destination in the entire world. Already #1. So putting these measures in place, we're like, is there anything before #1? I mean, we're like, how do you get better than the best? But we are, and we don't want to do anything to sort of wipe away those benefits. And that's what that would do by not only in creating, cost increases, things like that, but also making an unpredictable market. Because when you're making these long-term investment decisions, whether it's commodity contracts, whether it's building a plant that has a 20, 30-year lifespan and costs billions of dollars, whether it's negotiating agreements that are 20, 30 years out with your service contracts, you need to know that the laws are in place when you make these decisions, remain in place. You can allow them in order to guarantee employment for your workers, cost competitive prices for your consumers, and all of that. So very important.
I don't know that I would have anything really to add from the services perspective. I think we don't really know what the effect might be. Certainly haven't been mentioned in terms of potential targets, which is a good thing. So I think we'll just have to see. But I totally agree with the comment about the importance of jobs and the goal being to create more jobs in the United States. So I think, in that regard, we see services as a very, very important area where new, good, well-paying jobs can be created. And by that, of course, there's a range of kinds of services that are supplied. And there is a lower end of the wages that are paid in certain sectors. But what we focus on in a trade context, as a general matter, are those business services that are generally creating higher paying jobs. And so that's part of the message that we think is so important. And the last thing I will say is also totally agree with you about your comments about investment, that a tremendously important source of jobs in the United States, as well as one certainly in service sectors where there's outward direct investment, because those jobs support jobs in the United States.
Thank you, Christine, for bringing this back to jobs. But I'd like to focus on an agreement that you all mentioned, which is TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. As one of you mentioned the other 11 countries are signing the modified agreement, but President Trump also mentioned some kind of willingness to consider rejoining the pact. So I'd like to hear from you how important an agreement like TPP would be for each of your industries. I know it's a big market out there. I think it's like 40% of the world market. So Angela, would you like to, you touched on it, but you can elaborate if you'd like.
Sure. So I would say Farmers for Free Trade is happy about the glimmer of hope. What we then call it in letter accommodation is another question. But, again, as I mentioned, one of the primary reasons this agreement, or our organization started, is because there was an opportunity to sell more to a very critical trading partner such as Japan, in a market that we've been striving to open and work with and collaborate with for decades in all the major ag sectors. So, taking that off the table became a major challenge for many of our growers. Secondarily, we know that our trading partners are very busily engaging those other markets. And there's also a number of agreements going on with Europe, I would encourage as well. The Canadians in Europe are implementing their agreement. For agriculture, those are our same commodities. Those are our competitors. And so not only are we trying to preserve what we have right now, it's no longer do no harm, but don't lose any further ground. We just cannot afford the opportunity to step back in time with these agreements.
So do you feel that the farmers, large and small, understand the importance of trade today?
So we spent a lot of time in farm country and at ag conferences. If you had this conversation, I would say, and my colleague Jennifer Spall's here as well, she's been to many of these conferences, TPP was not explained well. It was very complex. It was 1,000 pages. Many of you in the room, and we all have worked on the agreement for years, but we didn't communicate it back home. And so most people thought it was a losing agreement that didn't involve our trading partners that exist. They didn't understand it was a market access opportunity for the U.S., and they didn't realize it modernized much as what we're trying to do in NAFTA today. So having that conversation in very practical terms, I think we're starting to see a pivot toward engagement and many positive signs from even senators and governors across the country who are starting to become more engaged and asking for participation back into the agreement.
Julie, would you like to?
Sure. I'm just for our sector, TPP was really important, and we were very strongly behind TPP, not just because of our role here in the U.S., but the idea that for global brands, we could have the same rules for products that might be made in the U.S. that we could sell then in Japan and, of course, Canada and Mexico and in Chile and in Australia and Vietnam, and kind of looking at this as a way to build to something that would be even bigger, to kind of rationalize how we can do business and improve the rules of the road, so to speak, for doing business. So that was huge for us and a big disappointment. Not just, Vietnam is the second largest supplier of apparel to the U.S. And is still one of the fastest growing suppliers to the U.S., even without TPP. So in a sense, TPP got our sector to find a good sourcing destination, but we could have done so much more and developed so much more if it was duty-free. So, the idea that there's this glimmer of hope, I think that's a positive, although I'm pretty skeptical that it's something that we're going to see anytime soon and that we're going to stay in our defensive posture for a while.
Well, before we go on, Julie, you mentioned the rules of the road. Yeah. And maybe people don't really know what those rules of the road, but TPP did have many rules that were very helpful to traders and investors, including customs. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit and the others could elaborate, because I think
Sure.
it would be helpful to the audience to understand exactly what it did.
Yeah, good point, Evelyn. I kind of glossed over that. But, part of what was exciting, I think, about TPP was the idea that even if the agreement didn't solve all the problems, it was going to create processes so what our goal was is that you could manufacture in one TPP country and sell in them all. And that eventually we would get to a single label, single testing requirements, improved customs rules so that you could not have to basically deal with different rules entering each country, which was huge, especially for Japan, as we were looking this for the longer term. So that was part of what we wanted, as well as we were going to talk. I mean, TPP spoke about e-commerce and looking at service. It looked at everything and really tried to bring it into the 21st century, which was why we spent so much time and travel going to those negotiations. And I still kept the box of my papers, actually, because I'm hopeful that someday it may come back. I did not throw them out, but I think we have a long way to wait.
Go ahead. Well, I think, I would maybe have a slightly more measured response in the sense that it was absolutely the case that CSI supported TPP as it was negotiated at the time. But unfortunately, in the course of the discussions that followed that initial agreement, I think, as everybody knows, there were a list of areas that were exempted or reserved for the day that the U.S. might decide to re-enter TPP. So one of the first things, and I will say we were happy to hear President Trump's raise the possibility of thinking about TPP again, no doubt about that. But the thing that we'll have to look at very closely is how do we negotiate back those reservations, particularly in the services and investment areas, or things like delivery services that we care a lot about, investment that we care a lot about, and other elements that were removed. And it's, I think it's going to be a real challenge once we get to that point of how do we renegotiate those things back. The second thing I will say is that fortunately in NAFTA, in a number of areas like digital trade, financial services, we're attempting to go beyond what we achieved in TPP. So if we re-engage in TPP, I think we would definitely want to draw in those elements that we're now trying to achieve in NAFTA.
Okay. We're getting sort of towards the end, but not quite. If there was
I don't think anybody will object to getting a
Right.
drink early.
No, but we have plenty to talk about. The question is whether we want to start. Well, if you were, there has been a shift in trade policy and to a view that we create more jobs by erecting tariffs to protect workers, as opposed to opening up markets by, expanding market access. How do we change that? I know you're all involved with coalitions trying to educate. Is there, give us your thoughts on how to change that viewpoint, or that closing the borders will create more jobs versus opening, creating greater market access worldwide. And it's a big question, but just a thought, if you could offer a thought to the audience.
Well, I think it's beyond what each of our coalitions are doing and what things like CSIS is doing, or the Heritage Foundation, and all the think tanks, and they're doing a fantastic job. And I think the key is getting outside of our little, sort of the DC, metro area, and going out to where you have the farmers, where you have the manufacturers, and where you have sort of the people who don't go to events like this, maybe, and reading the same things, and explain it, but also be very transparent, honest, and empathetic. I think because there has been a lot of pain felt from communities, and it's been very concentrated, and showing them stats. Oh, but overall the job loss was only that. That's not exactly the way to sort of win hearts and minds. So I think being authentic and really trying to help and make sure people have access to the educations that they're going to need for the future. We're still learning what that even is, but what does that mean, and how can we work together? And I think it's maybe something that governments and industry and associations and academia all need to work together to sort of explain that, and from an early age. From an early age, explain to people how the economy actually works, and how things, when you go to the grocery store, or you go to the shop, or when you use your iPhone, like sort of all the things come together, and how that all relates, and that it is because of these open, and I mean, if we look at history, anytime you've built borders or walls, people have crossed them. So, I mean, we can try, but.
Can I say something?
Absolutely.
And I just want to say, from a sector where we still have very high tariffs, so the fact is that a tariff doesn't necessarily create jobs here or keep jobs here. So the tariff on like a man-made fiber jacket is 32%. The average tariff may be under 5%, but you pay very high duties on your apparel, and that still hasn't kept the apparel manufacturing here in the United States. I mean, I think that's part of the mistake in the whole debate and discussion about the 232s is they will have a temporary impact, but in terms of keeping the jobs in the long run, it's going to be because you're competitive, not because you have a high tariff.
Okay. Do you have any?
I'll just say one thing. We have to simplify the messaging.
Yeah.
I mean, the conversation that we're having here, even today, it's complex. Going back into the heartland, talking about a 232, talking about some of the things we recognize from a trade policy does not relate. What relates is what decision are you making every day that impacts your business, your family? I love to use the test. If my family can understand it, and by the way, I have a 12-year-old daughter who is a Girl Scout. She came home the other day, and I think we kind of survived it, which said, you know, Mom, I was working in the neighborhood, and the little girl across the street, well, she's a Girl Scout, but she said she's not going to sell in this neighborhood. We only do friends and family. I said, well, what'd you say to that? She said, well, great. I have the rest of the neighborhood. That's trade, right? It's just that easy.
Got an entrepreneur there.
Isn't that great? She's on it. But again, it's that conversation about how it impacts your business. And we have to find a way to simplify these trade terms and everybody become an ambassador. Back to those home districts right now, it's critically important.
Okay, so if there was one thing you would want to say to this audience or leave a message that you'd like to leave with this audience about trade and jobs in your sector, what would that be? Christy, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I don't know if I could boil it down to one thing, but I will try and be brief. The first thing I would say is that having people understand that services is creating a positive trade balance for the United States. And Canada and Mexico are perfect examples of that. So it's an area where we can look to increase opportunities and increase jobs. Secondly, I think the point I started with in the beginning is that services is not a silo. It's not unto itself. It is actually undergirding and very much a part of all the other key sectors in the economy. So when you promote the growth of services, you're also promoting the growth of the other sectors like manufacturing, which we clearly need to address, and agriculture. So I think that's a very important message. The last thing, and I promise I will say this, is my association is not involved or doesn't have the expertise in worker retraining programs. But one thing we do like to point out is some examples of the things that our member companies are doing solely on their own to address worker retraining. For example, programs in high schools, Girls Who Code, or setting up universities in community colleges to train people with just high school educations on how to set up a network. So just two quick examples. Again, entirely private sector, no government involvement.
I think we need trades to create jobs. And this whole title of this event, we need that. We need more market access. We need more open borders. We need to bring in the parts and components, and for our sector manufacturing, put them in the hands of highly skilled American workers to make the products that are so competitive, not just here domestically, but all over the entire world. And that's exactly what we need. And training and workforce development is a huge part of that. There are several jobs that we just cannot fill because people do not have the skills that they need, not just in my industry, but in manufacturing as a whole. The National Association of Manufacturers, it's over 2 million jobs that cannot be filled. This is critical. I mean, before we create these new jobs, we need to fill the jobs that are already open and sort of get those in place. And again, we all need to work together. This is not a challenge that any organization, entity, or can handle on their own. We have to work together to make it, to do it.
And Toyota has some very exceptional training programs.
We do. That's a whole separate program, but we have partnerships with about 50 community colleges all across the United States to train workers, and it's a custom model, apprenticeship model that they built here for the American workplace, and it's not just for them to work in our plants. We look at it as contributing to we have a cluster in certain communities, whether it's in Indiana or Kentucky, in West Virginia, Alabama, Texas, is to make sure that we have highly skilled labor that maybe they work for us after they complete the program, or maybe they work for another automaker, maybe they work for a washing machine manufacturer, or whatever. We don't mind because we think we all benefit when we have communities of highly skilled workers who have options. It makes it very competitive, and that's our overall goal, is to really contribute to society through multiple ways.
Okay, so I agree with jobs, and we should really talk about retraining and what we can do for jobs for folks who have lost it due to trade. But I guess my message here is join coalitions, become part of whether it's global value chain, whether it's the auto, Farmers for Free Trade, CSI, all of us. It's important to have the voice out there and to share what everybody knows about what are the jobs that are created by trade, and change the narrative and amplify this message beyond this room.
And then just the last word again, we're all in this together. And I think the opportunity that we have to educate and empower is incredible when we work together throughout these organizations. So thanks, Evelyn, for the opportunity to be here.
Well, thank you all for participating in this great discussion. And thank you for listening to us. Drinks. Yes. Oh, I forgot the most important thing. Please join us for a drink and some beverages and some food. I know. Thank you for the.